I understand this is a gift given to me by my 3 children. I don't know whether it's Christmas and or birthday, but I just celebrated my 80th birthday. I have to assume that that's where it's coming from. Give you a little perspective about my life. Even though I have just turned 80 years old, I feel like on a bad day, 65, and on a good day, I feel like I'm 60. So I'm still very active. Never have intended to retire, and when I wake up in the morning, I'm anxious to get going and I still have a lot of energy. A person's makeup is basically from your background as far as the genetics from your parents and also the environment by which they bring you up into as your makeup, different personalities from the same parents, but I just wanted to reflect that a little bit about my parents. One of the strong things about my parents were they have a real strong Christian value system, and Jan's and my goal, Jan being my wife, is to pass on those Christian values on to the next generations as far as their heritage is concerned. My mom name was Margaret Bishop. I'm sorry, Margaret Bright, and her she came from a family of 4 siblings, and her dad was Ralph Bright. He never lived a lengthy life. I think he was maybe in his 50s when he passed away from a heart attack. They have a background of English. He had married my grandmother, Inez, and she had some Dutch pen, as I recall. And I also remember my great-great-grandmother. She was just a little lady who lived next door to Ralph and Inez, and that was my my grandpa's mother's. Ralph really was as occupation goes, was a farmer. He did not particularly, I don't think, had a passion for farming, but his dad had died fairly early, and he was destined to take over the farming. I think he had some other interests. I think he was in college, and he was pulled out of college to take over the farm. A little bit about my mom. What a saint. I've never heard anything negative said about my mother. And to go through life and not have somebody say something negative about you is quite an attribute. And it reminds me of Jan's mother as well. I never heard anything negative about her. And I think that's probably what attracted me to Jan is the relationship of her mother and what a sweet gal she was. But my mom was a very strong Christian, studied the Bible. She was a peacemaker in the family, a very gentle-spirited person. She was a hard worker. She got married young in life after high school. If she wasn't going on to college, what else do you do but get married? She was married at age 16 and had her first child sometime when she was 17. By the time she was 24, she had had 5 of us kids. Now, there were 6 of us, but it's kind of interesting to note back then how big of a families there were in the farming community. But she raised a big garden, did all the cooking, all the washing. I remember the old Wringer washer machine and how she hang the clothes out on the line. She just worked. She also helped milk the cows early morning, and at one point she even run the trap line when my dad was husking corn for neighbors and for his own use. She'd run the muskrat trap line in the morning, so they all worked hard. You don't think of women today who are raising kids to spend much time milking cows. She died a fairly early life. She was 79 years old. She had a sugar problem with diabetes. She actually died of a stroke. I well remember how much my mom appreciated going with my wife Jan to the Holy Land. They visited Israel, I think back in 1973, as I recall. About my father, Medford, he was of an English descent as well. His dad was named Dave. That would have been my grandfather. They came up to Northwest Ohio from West Virginia, settled in just north of Bairdstown, Ohio, which was in Wood County. In fact, there's a bishop by the name of Larry Bishop who still farms that farm, but they were living in an era, his dad was William Bishop, and he didn't have very good health. The story goes that you could read a newspaper anywhere on the farm 24/7 because the gas wells were burning off the extra gas, and there was just light all over. And he had a respiratory problem, and the doctor said, if you don't move out of this area, you're not going to live very long. And from whence they moved down to around Mount Blanchard, where there were not many gas lines there. That was during the boom of the it became Ohio Oil Company, predecessor to Marathon Oil. But they had a large family. Dave then bought some ground up around Mount Blanchard as he developed. My grandfather was a very hard worker. He farmed about 600, as I recall, 635 acres back with horses. He had 17 horses, and the story goes, according to my dad, that they would run the horses 2 hours a day if it were a really hot day, and 3 hours a day if it were not. And how Grandpa beat the game was that he put 3 horses on a 2-horse implement. My dad said he could care less about how hard the boys had to trot behind those horses, but he sure did take care of those horses. And with 17 horses, they would take them back to the barn and have another guy bring in a new team in, and they just kept running. And they worked day and night, literally, except for Sunday. They always took off Sunday except for the chores. But tell you a story. We were at, my son and I, Bruce, were at an auction one time looking at some farm equipment, and a gentleman came up to Bruce and said, I want to tell you something about your legacy. He said, you know, I knew your great-great-grandfather, which would have been Dave Bishop, and he said he was a hard worker. He was known for being a really hard worker, and he said every time I went out to the farm, he was already there working in the field. And he said, I wanted to surprise him. So one day he said, I get up really early before dawn, and he says, I rode my bicycle out there to the farm, and he said it was at the crack of dawn, and he says, I'll be darned if he wasn't already there working. But that was my grandfather. He was really someone that I had a lot of respect for, and he almost a mentor as far as I was concerned. But he certainly inspired me about the work ethic to be able to grow that many or plant and harvest that many acres. Not only did they do that, but they also ran a sugar camp, and it was just all work. Had a big family. There were 10 kids in the family. 3 boys and 7 girls, but they all worked. That was the name of the game back then. Used to go to reunions. There was the Bishop reunion at a Grange Hall down by Houghtown, Ohio. And I remember as a kid listening to the stories that the generation ahead of me would talk about, and they measured a person by the amount of work they could do, the worth of a person, by the amount of work that they could do in a day's time. The concentration was on, if you were going to be worth anything, you had to be a hard worker. The story goes that my grandfather was really strong. My Uncle Bob Sockerwriter told a story that when he would go to the elevator, back then they had heavy sacks for feed to take back home to the cattle and other animals. But they said normally 2 guys would grab a hold of an 80-pound bag and throw it on a wagon. Back then those wagons had spoke wheels and they were high, flatbeds. And they said my grandfather would grab 2 of those 80-pound bags, 1 on each shoulder, and go to the wagon with him and do a flip and throw them both onto the wagon. It just gives you an idea of how hard those people really did work. But that was interesting, an account of my grandfather. I used to go over there and help them with hay. Hay was a big thing back then because we not only sold hay, but we harvested hay, and I would help them make hay. And at lunchtime, we'd all come into the house to eat lunch. And my grandfather was real religious about it. He would give the prayer, and as soon as the prayer was over, he and my grandma, Lula, would start arguing. And I always found that kind of strange that they read the Bible, and as soon as the Bible and the prayer was given, man, they shot at each other in argument. But she could hold her own with him. It was kind of a saga that was very unusual. They kept everything separate. Grandma Luda had her farms and had tenant farmers on them because she had inherited those from her father, who was Bell. That was his name. And Grandpa had his farms. But there was a fence between the house and the barn, and that was the line of demarcation. Grandma took care of the lawn around the house, and on the other side of the fence, Grandpa took care of it. And the only common area they had was the garden that was kind of off the side. And both of them would work the garden, but Grandma wouldn't work in the barnyard, and Grandpa wouldn't work in the yard around the house. It was kind of a strange setup. In fact, I remember painting roofs over there, and Grandma paid me. Grandpa didn't have anything to do with it, and yet I worked a lot for my grandfather. He was so ambitious. He would slow down the elevator, taking bales up into the haymow, and he'd run it real slow. But it wasn't fast enough for him, so he would literally pile a steady stream of bales going up into the haymow and dumping them there. And 2 of us were to mile back in that great big hip roof barn. But that wasn't good enough. He would stack 2 bales, one on top of the other. And when the elevator was at the end of its load, of course, you didn't have new ones coming on. Well, the elevator would literally tip forward until it hit the beam on the barn where the opening was. But he was a worker. And then he said, "Come on, boys, we're going." And you couldn't sit around and drink water. You had to grab a quick drink because he made us go with him out to the field to get another load of hay. But while we were waiting for the load to come around to the end of the field, he said, "Well, now let's go pick up those shafts around, little groups of hay that the mower, well, it wouldn't be the mower, but the rake would miss." And he'd carry them over and put them on the windrow, and you know, he just didn't waste anything. But they had a good work ethic, no question about that. Grandfather Bell and another gentleman in Mount Blanchard, of where I grew up, started a bank. It was called the Citizen Bank of Mount Blanchard. They started the bank. Bell owned some farm ground, and he and Dr. Phil ran the bank, so they were involved with all the community activities as far as Mount Blanchard was concerned. Another interesting thing that I heard about my grandfather. I didn't learn this until late in life. At one time, the Ku Klux Klan came to the Methodist Church, and they were speaking, and my grandfather, I guess, got up in the middle of the sermon, and they were preaching Ku Klux Klan, and he said, "That is not right what you're preaching in a church or anywhere else," and he stormed out of the congregation, never to return again. My grandmother continued to go to the Methodist Church, but my grandfather, still very religious, read the Bible, listened to the radio on Sunday mornings, but he refused to go back to that Methodist church because it was a matter of principle to him. I was born in 1941. Wasn't quite called a World War II baby, but there were a lot of babies born then. I think a lot of it was to keep the men out of the war, but I remember Dad sitting on a porch. I couldn't have been very old because that war was 1945. I remember my dad sitting on the front porch listening to Roosevelt, and he was drafted to go in the war, but they didn't want farmers to be in war. And he would listen very intently on the radio. We had to keep real quiet as Roosevelt gave out the instructions what had happened for the week. But they needed farmers back then, and they needed food. And of course, my dad had at that point 5 kids, and so we were very dependent upon him. I remember back then, you couldn't get a new tire for on the farm. If you had a flat tire, we had quite a few spare patches that you could put on the inner tubes. And I remember putting patches on top of patches just to keep them running, and you used to see along the side of the road flatbeds. They held about 130 to 150 bushels of produce. They would be sitting along the sideline with a flat tire. There were a lot of flat tires back then because they didn't have the rubber. You couldn't buy a new tire. Same thing with the car. I remember back in 1949, we got our first new car. You had to order them way in advance because everything went for the war. My dad made maple syrup, and even then, they were commissioned to sell that syrup to the government I think at a fair price, but it wasn't an exorbitant price because they needed food for the Army personnel. I then went to the Blanchard School. It no longer exists. It became Riverdale when Wharton and Forest and Mount Blanchard came together. But my parents back then were very strict. We went to the Nazarene Church. It was a very fundamental church. With the strictness, I don't think it hurt any of us kids. I think we all turned out pretty decently, saving one, that's me. But I'll show you how strict they were. We couldn't play sports on Sunday. That was a day of rest. And one time my dad came out to play football because our neighbors kept coming down, coaxing us into playing football out there in the pasture field next to the house. And he finally came out, and that kind of broke the ice. From then on, we could play on Sunday afternoons. We played a lot of basketball in a neighbor's barn when I was growing up. The old plank floors, and when you dribbled, you didn't know where the ball was going to go. I don't know if that made you a better dribbler or you always had to look down to see where the ball was going to go. But the idea was not to have to look down at the ball to be able to dribble. But back then, sometimes you had to do that. But a lot of boys played in haymows. We didn't have the luxury of the modern day gymnasiums they have today to play. And I remember one night or one afternoon, one of the players got kicked out of the haymow, and they got bumped too hard and fell right on out onto the machinery. That wasn't a pleasant sight. But they were real strict. For instance, we couldn't play face cards. We could play Old Maid and Rook, but face cards were out of the question. There was something about being able to play with face cards. Another interesting thing is we weren't allowed to dance. That was kind of the Nazarene thing. I remember one time, and my wife would probably laugh at that, because she always enjoyed Elvis Presley, but there was going to be Elvis Presley on an Ed Sullivan show. It was a variety show, and we all gathered around a black and white TV to watch that. And Elvis got up there, and he was all right for a while, and then he started wiggling his hips, and they showed that on the Ed Sullivan show. And I tell you, my dad jumped up out of his chair, went over and shut off the TV, and his exclamation was, "We will not watch anything like that in this house. And furthermore, we will never watch Ed Sullivan again if he would stoop so low as to put him on his show. That's it. We're done." But they were kind of strict in that regard. Another interesting thing, well, my dad lived to be 90, almost 97. He was a strong man. If you shook hands with him, you knew you were shaking with a handshake. He was also a man of little patience. I mean, if he told you to do something, he told you once, and you better darn well do it, or you were going to be in trouble. He had no problem getting the paddle out or taking his belt off and slapping you with a belt, putting it back on. But he died of cancer. Back then, the farmers didn't have cabs. They didn't have, most of them didn't have umbrellas over their tractors. So they were out in that sun day in and day out. And a lot of farmers had problems with skin cancer. And he fought that. They practically shaved his face off as the years went on, because that always showed up about 20 years later. And finally he had a little spot on his lip. And that's been after his mother, or his wife, my mom had passed away. And, you know, he said, you know, I'm tired of fighting this. And he just let it go. He didn't want to fight it anymore, because he'd been fighting skin cancer, and he had big growth on his parotid gland. It metastasized there, and they had shrunk it out with the radiation very successfully. He said, I'm just tired. I think he was very lonely at the end, and he refused to go to a nursing home. He would have enjoyed nursing home because he enjoyed talking to people, but he just left it go, and it literally ate his whole upper lip off, got into his nose. We saw a little sore develop between his nose and his eye, and eventually it got to his brain and finished him off. But the doctor said at age 70, he had a heart of a 40-year-old. He had, I think, an enlarged heart. Just like his dad, he's a very strong person. But I tell you one thing, you never said, I can't do it around my dad. I'll tell you a story. My older brother Marlon and I, he was 2 years older, we always had to do the milking. After the milking, we'd go in to eat. And we always ate at 6 o'clock at night, and, except for the one person who had to stay on the farm tractor and keep that farm tractor going. We didn't have the lights that they have today with farm equipment, so we would push as hard as we could on that. But we were milking a cow, and she was a fresh Holstein cow. And I tell you, when we grabbed a hold of that teat, she would swing her back leg around and just hit you really hard. And I mean, we were besides ourselves. We couldn't milk that cow. And we've been milking for years. We must have been in junior high. And my dad came out of the breezeway and yelled across the driveway into the barn and says, "What's wrong with you guys? We're supposed to eat at 6 o'clock. Get that cow milked." And I came out of the barn door and responded back and said, "Dad, we can't milk her." Well, you never say you can't with my dad. So he said, "Well, get her milked." And he came back about 10 minutes later and says, "Where are you boys at? You're supposed to have those chores done." And I said, "We can't milk her." And he comes flying across that that lawn and into the barnyard, and he was just moving his little arms like he was mad, which he was. And the old cow, or the young heifer, was up against the wall in the stanchions, and he put that bucket underneath there, and he was going to show us how to milk a cow. And he grabbed a hold of those front two teats, and I'm telling you, she came around. My brother and I looked at each other. We knew what was going to happen, and sure enough, she clobbered him. Her foot ended up in the pail and bent the bottom of it all up. And, Dad was so mad. He paces off about 8 steps and comes running at the Holstein cow in her back flank, and literally raised her off the ground with his shoulder, and he spread eagle with his feet, and he stripped that cow down. He put some little milk in his hands and lubricated those teats, and I'm telling you, he went to milk them. I've never seen a cow milk so fast as that poor heifer, but he stripped her down, and he grabbed the back teats and did the same thing. And the milk, he didn't care about the pail anymore. I mean, it was damaged anyhow. The milk was just running all over in little little streams, and the old cats and the dog were just licking it up for all they were worth. And when he got done, he backed off, and the cow fell down and tried to gather herself with her hind feet because she's been up in the air. And he says, "Oh, that's the way we milk a cow. Let's go eat." So we knew then that you didn't mess with my dad, because that's just the way he was. I remember one time my older brother, he was a senior in high school, and he was very athletic. He was involved in football and basketball. He made some wise comment. All 6 of us kids, plus Mom and Dad, were sitting around the table. My dad didn't take kindly to what he had to say. I remember him reaching his foot over the corner of the table and grabbing my brother by in the crotch of his elbow, and just grabbed him and swung him right out of the kitchen, out through the breezeway, and he said, "You need to cool off a little bit." And all of us kids were just nervous and scared. And he went on in the living room and read the paper, and about half hour later, he said, "Denny, you better go out and get your brother. I think he's probably cooled off by now." But that's the way Dad was. You know, you just didn't mess with it. Those are kind of interesting stories. But he was a good person, very religious. He had a lot of principle to him, but you just didn't mess with him. One of the things that we did a lot when I was a kid growing up, we spent a lot of time in the woods. My dad would not let me go past a tree without asking me, "Now, what kind of tree is that?" I had to identify them. And not only, the next series of questions was, "Well, now what is that tree used for?" He was always teaching. And I learned my trees really early in life. And, you know, you had to know the maple trees because you had to tap them. And I remember one time somebody tapped the wrong tree, and he laughed and laughed about a guy doesn't even know what a maple tree looks like. Of course, it didn't have any leaves on. I mean, you went totally by the bark and the shape of the tree. But we spent a lot of time, because we burned at the house with wood, and we also burned at the sugar camp. You had to do a lot of cutting, and we didn't have a chainsaw. Back then, the chainsaws were big and heavy anyhow. But we did that with the old crosscut, back and forth. If you ever got cold out in the woods, you never complained to your dad, because he would get you on the other end of that crosscut, and you stayed warm for a long time. He just kept coming at us, you know. So we learned a long time ago, way back then, not to complain about being cold. Rather be cold than be on the other end of that crosscut. But I spent a lot of time in the woods, and for that, the reason I think I enjoyed being in the woods. In fact, the last 2 houses that Jan and I have been in the woods. We cleared off a clearing and put a house in the woods. That's part of the closest I can get to God is just being in the woods and enjoying Mother Nature. I enjoy the flora and the fauna that goes along with living in the woods. It just settles me down as far as that is concerned. But Dad made a lot of maple syrup. I remember one year we made 300 gallons, maple syrup. That's a lot of syrup for one family. But it was a camaraderie of people who would come in and help. And it was just kind of, you've been cooped up all winter long, and it was a chance to get out in the woods in the springtime. Maple syrup flowed when the winters were, or the days were frozen at night, and in the afternoon it would thaw out, and that's what forced the gas pressure for the maple sap to go up to the buds. And that's when you made your maple syrup. He had horses that we used in the woods. We also used them for making, gathering, before we got into bales of hay, for loose hay. The two horses would straddle the windrow, and so he would load hay by himself, because those horses were really well trained. Those horses were so well trained when we went through the woods by the end of the season that they could hear our footsteps in the leaves, and without commands, they would flow through the woods with us on the trail. And back then farmers were attached to their horses. I mean, they were with them every day. They trained them how to work. And I remember my dad, when the glue factory, well, he sold them to the glue factory, and I saw tears running down his cheek. You don't think about that when you have farm equipment. It's a tractor's a tractor, combine's a tractor, but horses has something personal. I'm reminded that my mother really didn't get married when she was 16, but 17. I want to make that correction. And my grandfather was Bruce's great-grandfather when we were talking earlier. One thing that my dad really was good at, and it showed up in the family, was that he was a tremendous ice skater. He and my grandfather, Dave, lived on the Blanchard River, or on the banks of the Blanchard River, and the boys would play a lot of hockey at night. They'd put a big bonfire out along the banks of the river, and they played a lot of hockey. And my dad and my Uncle Herman were really good skaters. In fact, it has been told that if there were a professional team around, that they would have been on that team. And they were only like a mile and a half away from Mount Blanchard, so a lot of kids would come down and ice skate on the Blanchard River. And a lot of that was done at night after the chores were done. But one thing they did was, in the shallow end of the Blanchard River, it's almost like rapids, they would take a swath about this wide and cut the ice and flip the one side down and tuck straw in it, and that would dam up the water so it would flow over the ice. And every so often, when the ice got too rough, they would smooth it out. They had to do it when the wind wasn't blowing, and they always had a nice ice skating rink there. But I remember my dad on Sunday afternoons would take us ice skating down on the Blanchard River, not there, but another place where it was more sheltered. So all of us kids knew how to ice skate. In fact, that carried through with our kids. When we built the last two houses, we had ponds, and I remember when the boys were, including Dawn, she was ice skating too, but when they were in high school, they had a lot of friends over, and we had lights out there on the pond, and they did a lot of ice skating. They played a lot of hockey out on the two ponds. Both the boys were good skaters. Talk a little bit about my youth. What was important to my parents as well as to me was I accepted Christ as my personal Savior when I don't know, it was 11 years or maybe 13 years of age. That was important to each of us kids. And our parents made sure that we knew the Lord, which was a real God thing for them. I spent most of my time growing up outside. I always enjoyed being outside. I didn't particularly enjoy being inside. We boys did a lot of muskrat trapping. In fact, we relied upon getting money in trapping. I remember one year pelts were up to $3 a pelt. We would run them at on a rainy night, we would go out at midnight, and then we'd come back again at around 4:30, get up and go run the trap lines. If it were raining, the muskrats seemed to run the runs then. I remember one time I got a muskrat. He had chewed both of his front legs off, and he was chewing on his third leg because he was caught on the third leg. It was down to the bone, but we were able to salvage that pelt. Spend a lot of time outside. On November 15th of every year was hunting day, and if it came during the week when there was a school day, there was no school at Mount Blanchard. In fact, all the local schools in the county did not have didn't have school that day because all the boys went hunting for pheasants and for rabbits. So I enjoyed that as well. Used to do a lot of pest hunting. I think I won the pest hunt for Hancock County. We would go into a barn and we'd take a pole cane, fishing pole cane, and run it up and down the rafters and get the flashlight at each end of the barn. And actually, I remember holding the flashlight in my mouth so that birds would come flying to it, because they would fly at night towards the light, and then we'd grab them and jerk off their heads and put them in our pockets. And Mom was not too happy about having blood-stained pockets coming the next day when she had to wash the blue jeans. But that was a fun thing to do, and killing rats and mice and saving their tails, putting them in formaldehyde and having the big count. We had a lot of fun pest hunting, and the farmers would love for you to come by and kill them. I remember one night, I think we had a really exceptional night. I think we got 200 sparrows and starlings out of one barn. That was a good night. Remember making, when I was a little kid, bows and arrows, just outdoors doing different things, you know. I started school when I was 5 years old. I was really late in the class. Quite a few kids, though, would start back then, but I was one of the younger ones in our class. I think when I was a sophomore, I was the second smallest boy in our class. I think I weighed 122 pounds when I went out for football. Obviously, I didn't make the team. I never really started to develop. Between my junior and senior year, I grew up like a beanstalk. I gained my height to about 6'3", but I was lanky and uncoordinated and run down the basketball court, stumbling over my big feet. And I really didn't mature physically until I got into college, and that's where I tried to excel in sports. But I played basketball in my senior year on varsity, and defense. I played safety. I was too small to be on the line. One of the things that we had to do when I was growing up and related to school, that I was left-handed, so whenever we planted tomatoes, ran sugar beets, popcorn, plus all the other hay. We did a lot of hay. I think I remember one year my dad had 90 acres of hay, and we were in the baling position then. We weren't making it loose, and it was just a lot of work. We actually went to football practice to get away from work. The town boys didn't look at it that way, but a lot of farm boys, you know, they worked hard back then. And you know, when we went to first day of football practice, we were in shape because we've been bucking bales all summer long. But it was just natural. But I remember being left-handed, and we had a tomato picker that you had to have 4 people. It was a 2-row tomato picker, and since I was left-handed, it was easy for a left-hander to put them in on one side, and on the other side you had a right-hander putting them in. So my dad said whenever the tomatoes come in, the plants, they would be about that tall, that you were going to stay home from school. So I would stay home from school in the springtime, maybe for 2 or 3 days, planting tomatoes. But you know, the superintendent, the principals knew that you were all home working, and it was no big thing. They just accepted that. Baled a lot of hay, a lot of straw, hoeing. I mean, I remember one time we were hoeing weeds. We always had to hoe those thistle patches. They kept coming right on back. But one time it started raining, and we thought, man, we're going to get off the rest of the day because it was raining. And my dad, we came up with our hose, and Dad said, "Oh no, you're not." He said, "We're going to go pull weeds." We were pulling mustard weeds the rest of the afternoon in the rain. My dad and grandfather, they just wouldn't quit. But they were not unlike a lot of other farmers. That's just what they did. Well, going on, one other interesting thing about the farm life, I had 5 brothers and sisters. It went boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl as far as the chronology is concerned. But we worked together as a team, a family. You all worked together. When we went out to hoe tomatoes, you know, each of us took a row, and those of us who got done earlier than the girls generally had a little harder time staying up with the fellows. We would turn around and hoe back to them to get the row done, and we'd all start on a new row. When we were really young, we couldn't even sharpen hoes. We would go, Dad would sharpen all the 5 of us. Beth was not along at that time, she came later, but Dad in the morning, he would sharpen the hose with a file and take us, he said, go out to the pasture field or go out to this field. And we'd work there all day. He gave us Mom would give us a gallon jug of water, and she put white cloth on it and a Band-Aid or a rubber band around the top, and fold it back over, and we dip that in water so the cloth would evaporate, keep the water as cool, and we all drank out of that 1-gallon container, and we come home at noon, and while we ate, Dad would go out to the shop and sharpen up those hoes again for the afternoon, and we were never allowed to come in until the cows came in. And of course, we boys, we threw a few rocks at the cows to get them stirred up to come in earlier sometimes. It worked back then. But, you know, if I could sum up what we did when we were kids, it was, if I could sum it up in one word, it was just plain work. But we weren't alone. A lot of the farm kids were the same way. Well, anyhow, I ended up going off to college. I went to Bluffton College. It was a Mennonite school. It was a small school. I felt that I would do better there at a small school than going to a big school like Ohio State. I went there to play basketball, and I ended up playing football and track. An interesting story on track. I had never seen a track meet. I didn't know what a track meet was. We didn't have it, never saw it on TV. And I remember being in the shower one time, I said, how do you play this game called track? The boys practically laughed me out of the shower room. But and the first track meet, coach put me in a mile. Fine, whatever you want me to run in. And I took off at a 60-second pace, that was record-breaking time for the 4-minute mile, but I didn't know that. You know, I never paced myself. And I remember the coach yelling out after the first lap, he says, "Slow down, Bish." And I think, why would a coach tell you to slow down in a race? Aren't you supposed to run as fast as you can for as long as you can? Well, about a half a lap later, I knew exactly what he was talking about. The old anchor grabbed a hold of me and slowed me way down. But I had such a lead that I ended up winning the race. And I was huffing, puffing, laying on the ground, trying to get my breath. There's no way to run a mile without being a good pace. And Kenny Mass, my coach, came over there and was just laying down and grabbing air. He said, "Denny," he said, "that was a nice race. You got to work on your pacing." But he says, "Rest up, the 2 miles coming." I said, "Oh, coach, there's no way I can run a 2 mile. I mean, it was a cold day. Of course, in early spring, it's cold anyhow. And I was just stiff. My muscles were just stiff and aching. And finally, he said, well, they called the 2 mile. He says, get in there. And so I did. The first 2 laps, I mean, they were terrible. I mean, it took me that long to get all the kinks out of my muscles. And I stayed at the back of the track. I said, I don't care whether the wind is anything or not. He said, well, you should run it anyhow because it'll get you in shape. And I said, yeah, I like fun. But anyhow, after about 4 laps, you had to run 8 laps for a 2-mile race. And after about the first mile, I said, man, this isn't too bad. I'm starting to warm up. So I went on up to the head of the pack, or close to it. I never liked to run first. I always liked to run in second place, so the guy in front of me could cut the wind. And if we were running with the wind to our back, well, I was getting the advantage of that wind. So a little physics being involved in that. And I said, well, I might as well win this race. I had a lot of natural speed for a Division III school, and so I ended up winning it. And the kids razzed me. Never knew what a track meet was, and you had to get 10 points to get a letter, and you got 5 points for winning the race. And so I got my track letter the first event, or the first time we ran track. I think it was against the University of Findlay. Back then it was Findlay College. So they teased me all the way home on that one. I went over to play basketball, but the coach that we had emphasized offense, and he really liked the Indiana ball players because there was a run and shoot type offense. And I remember one time I scored in the JV game 24 points, and he would always go over and look at the score tablets. And he said, well, you dress for varsity. And I thought to myself, that isn't right, because one thing I didn't want to be known for is to be a ball hog. The only way you're going to play varsity is to be a ball hog. After the second year, I said, you know, this is not my game. So I stuck it out with football and enjoyed football. I was a kicker for a kickoff man for Bluffton for several years until my senior year. I was kickoff man too, and I broke my leg the third game against Wilmington College. We were having a good time on our side of the ball, and they set me up with a fullback and an end that double hit me so hard that my head hit the ground on a soft, wet playing field and knocked me out. And my ankle blew up like this. I mean, it really swelled up. Old Doc Radeball over there, he was a horse doctor. He was an Army doctor, and he put a cast on it. It would ache so much because that blood would pool down there and just ache. It was really painful when I walked to classes. So I went to the doctor. I said, Doc, we got to take this off after several weeks. I said, the pain is just killing me. And I thought I had a good threshold for pain, but obviously I didn't. And he said, well, you only have another 3 weeks. He says, we'll let it go. I remember going back to the dorm and taking my knife and cutting it off, and took it back to him and handed it to him. I says, I think we need a new cast, which he put one on. But I enjoyed track. The last couple of years, I think I went undefeated. What's that old saying go, that he who don't toot his own horn, the same as never tooted? I think I went undefeated my last couple of years. Well, even prior to that in the other races, but I was able to go down to a shorter race. And that helped me out in football as far as speed goes, because I was playing defensive end for the most part. We had a really good, one year we had a really good track it was a mile relay team. We went 3:23.3, and we broke the school record. In fact, we were only, I think, 5 seconds off of the timing that Ohio State University was running, and we were just a little school, but we had some good quarter milers. I ended up with the A.C. Berkeley Award, which is the senior athlete of the year type award. But I only played football and basketball the last 2 years. But my senior year, I only played only 3 games there. And then later was inducted into the Hall of Fame for playing sports over there. And also, again, tooting your own horn. And I don't mean it in a bragging sense, but I was also the most popular man on campus as far as the voting of the populace there. And you ended up becoming king your senior year. So I was king my senior year of the school. we had to pay, as kids, we had to pay our own way through college. And so I had to work a lot. I was so afraid that I was going to flunk out that I spent my evenings studying away. Weekends, on Saturday, I would not study on Sunday. That was one of those things. I figured if I'm going to school, that's work to me. And so I would study all day Saturday, right up to game time. I remember that Saturday night, the dorm practically emptied out, but I stayed there and studied because I was so afraid I was going to flunk out, at least my freshman year. So I really dug into the study. But we had to, all of us kids had to work hard. I remember having basically 2 jobs during the summertime to get through college, and I had a job on campus. I was playing sports and trying to keep my studies up, and I had a janitor job on campus just to make ends meet. Didn't have enough money to buy a car. Never had a car when I was in college. Just work. I remember going to Chicago between my freshman and sophomore year. I had a roommate that got me a job at a mosquito abatement district, and the first day we were to dig a trench for draining a lagoon, and we went in more and got started, and the straw ball said, "We'll take a break." It was like an hour, take a break, and I just kept right on going. And he came up to me, tapped me on the shoulder. He says, "I said we'll take a break." I said, "Why would I take a break?" He said, "Well, you'll never last a day." I said, "Are you kidding me?" I said, "I'm a farm boy." "What do you mean?" And it was just natural for me because that's the way we worked on the farm. In fact, we were going to quit early. We were going to quit 4:30. And I looked at noon, and there were 4 other guys on another line, and I was only one on my line, and I had dug a lot farther than all 4 of them put together. But every hour they would take a break. And he finally came up and said, "Bishop, you got to take a break." I says, "No, I remember you're paying me good money, and I'm gonna give you a good day's work." And that's just the way I felt about it. And so the next day I went into work. He was literally a drunk. He came up to me, and he ran the backhoe. He said, "I understand you're a farm boy." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You know how to drive a tractor?" I said, "Well, of course." He said, "Come with me." And so I spent the rest of the summer on a tractor, and all I did was sit on the tractor every 3 minutes and move it forward while he ran the backhoe. I tried to get to use the backhoe, but he would never let me do it for insurance purposes or whatever. But so it made it a little easier. But I remember in the evening, I needed money, so I went down the street from one establishment to another, and I came across a fast food establishment. They served a lot of ice cream and hamburgers, and there was an Irish lady, redhead, and not that makes any difference, but I said, "I'm looking for a job." She said, "I just fired the last man I'm ever going to hire." He says, "All you do is you flirt with the girls and keep them from working. There's no way I'm going to hire another man." I says, "Ma'am, I'm going to college. I need a job." She said, "Well, that's tough, type thing." And I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll work for you for a week. You don't need to pay me if you're not satisfied with me. But if you are satisfied with me, give me an honest week's worth of pay." She says, she looked at me and says, "You really do want a job, don't you?" And she took me on, and it was funny. All the girls would save Denny's Corner, all the ice cream. Of course, when you're young like that, I had a lot of desserts. I think a lot of the girls made mistakes on purpose so they keep that corner full for Denny Bishop. That was kind of a fun thing to do. But let's see, what else? Oh, my major was biology, and another interesting thing is hitchhiking. Back then, didn't have a car, you hitchhiked. And when I was working that summer, my oldest sister, Ann, was getting married back in Findlay, Ohio. And so I worked right up to the Friday night, 4:30, 5 o'clock. And I started hitchhiking from Chicago back to Findlay, Ohio. I had a suitcase and I put on there Ohio, and then when I got to Ohio, I put down Toledo. When I got to Toledo, I put down Findlay, and you know, and that's how I got home. I was able to get home in time for the wedding, which was Saturday afternoon, and turn around, and or maybe it was Sunday, I forget. But anyhow, turned right around after the wedding and hitchhiked back to Chicago. Was there at 6 o'clock in the morning, ready to go to work. But that's how you got around. You would never expect to do that today. And the first summer after I graduated from Bluffton, I still didn't have a car, and I got a call. And it was back in the recession. It was hard to get jobs. I never had any problem getting a job because I ended up painting barn roofs. I painted my dad's barn roof. The neighbor comes by and says, "Wow, you did a good job there. Would you paint mine?" And pretty soon I had more barn roofs to paint than I could handle. And this is during a recession when a lot of the college kids couldn't get jobs. And so I hired the quarterback for Bluffton, and we were both graduated from Mount Blanchard, and he couldn't find a job, and I was left-handed, he was right-handed. So we just marched across, each of us on our own side, and we got to the last sheet. We'd flip, and I would paint his side, and he'd paint mine, and it worked perfectly well. But you know, we had to hitchhike. But anyhow, my sister called and said, "Hey, I got a job for you at a mobile home park or at a mobile home building place up in Marlette, Michigan." And so I had to get a ride there. My uncle Herman was going to Findlay. So he gave me a ride to Findlay to the, back then we had Greyhound service. And that, I got a Greyhound. All I had to have was with me is a hammer. I had to have a hammer that next morning to start work. And I hitchhiked I had a ride to Detroit, and that was back in 1963, yeah. And that was when Chicago was burning. And they dropped me off in the middle of Chicago, and you know where the Greyhound depot is, or not Chicago, I'm at Detroit. You know, it's right in the where the city was literally burning. And I remember getting out and starting walking towards Marlette, Michigan, which was in the thumb of Michigan. And I remember a carload of 4 or 5 black people in a car driving real slow right next to me. I was walking on a sidewalk, and you could smell the stench from Detroit burning. And they went around the block 3 times. And when it came down along me, they went real slow. I was pretty scared then. I knew I could probably outrun them all because I was fresh out of running track, but I knew I also couldn't outrun a bullet. So, but I ended up, I got a ride up to Imlay City on 53, and a guy took me there in a bulk truck, milk truck, and left me off. And I didn't even know where Marlette, Michigan was. I'd never been there. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. So there was a bar in the corner where he left me off. So I went into the bar and said, "Anybody going north here?" And an old drunk, I mean, he was drunk, said, "I'm going there, let me finish my beer." And so I should have been the driver, but he drove all over the road. And he took me to my sister's place. They were living in a mobile home there. And I knocked on the door, and somebody at 1:30 came to the door. I was so relieved to get there that night. But you know, you didn't have a car. I really didn't date much when I was in high school, or I had other interests in sports and being outdoors, and work was a big thing. But and even in college, didn't date much. So I was so involved in sports and work and studies. So that was part of my life. And I didn't have a car to date anyhow, so didn't do much of that. My first year out of college, then I took a teaching job up in Liberty Center, Ohio. I was teaching biology and also coaching. I had all 3 sports: basketball, football, and track. And I was assistant football and basketball, but had track. And I really enjoyed coaching. I enjoyed the boys. And then, well, I was teaching at age 20, let's see, that would have been 21. And I had students that were only 2 years younger than me. I never told them how young I was, but they probably could have guessed that. But pretty young to be teaching 21 when you have kids that are only 2 years younger than you. At least the older ones were 2 years younger. And then after that, I decided to go start on my master's degree. I went to Ohio State that summer, and they had a job opening in Findlay at the junior high, the first year Central Junior High was, and I wasn't really interested in taking the job, but they coaxed me into it. Well, I had a friend who was my previous coach from Mount Blanchard, Jim Sievert. He coaxed me into it because he had then moved on to Findlay in the teaching. And I was teaching science, and back then, science teachers were hard to come by because we were in the Sputnik era, and Russia was way ahead of us in math and science. And so I was teaching there for only 1 year. And I remember letting my deferment go for the Army, and Goldie, who was after all of us boys who were qualified for the draft, she nailed me. And I tell you, our principal was really upset with me for letting my deferment go. So I went down to Columbus, took the written test, and then we all, about 20 of us, lined up naked, and the doctor was coming by and checking us out, and he threw that light gizmo into my right ear. Well, I couldn't hear out of my right ear because I had lost it when I was 5 years old with scarlatina. And in fact, interesting enough, my trick at the Island Park at Mount Blanchard was to go underwater, and the kids would go underwater and watch me blow air out of my ear. But it got infected, and the bones welded together, fused together, and I didn't have an eardrum. And when the doc shoved that thing in my ear, it was a sensitive ear anyhow. I never said a thing, but I turned around and gave him one stern look. And he said, "Hold still, young man, you're in the Army now." And I didn't smile a bit. And the second time he stuck it in there, he stuck it in much more gently. I have an old saying that goes, "Gently like a porcupine makes love." But anyhow, stuck that in there, and he said, "You know you have an extra hole in your head?" I says, "That's right, sir." He says, "You just entered your military career. Go get dressed." I was a happy person going back. So I finished teaching that year, and then I taught 2 years to high school. And that's where I met Jan. Jan's sister was a harpist. She was playing, I just met her the night before. She was playing a harp at Findlay High School, and I was there at the high school teaching. And I heard this sweet music coming from the music department. So I just walked casually down on my way out from school. And I said, "Gee, I just met another gal who was playing the harp." And Jan said, "Yeah, that's my sister, Lynn." I said, "Yeah, that's who it was, Lynn Candle." And I said, "Well, I've never seen you on campus." I said, there were about 1,600 students there at that time at Findlay High School. And I said, "What grade are you in?" She says, "I'm a junior." And I said, "I've never seen you." She says, "At Capital University." Here she was home, going to school where the harp was so she could practice. So we had a little conversation there. I thought, "Well, that's a pretty cute little girl." So I went to the office, a privy of a teacher. I checked out her grades, and wow, this girl's smart. She was had a high IQ, and I said, "Man, that might be a catch." So I asked her out for a date, and she really didn't want to go out with me, I don't think, but I had a red Chevy, and she loved red, so she went out with the red Chevy and me, and the rest is history. But actually, I started dating my boss because her father was Dr. Candle, and he had been a veterinarian, and he was president of the school board. So I got a lot of teasing from the other teachers as I continued to date her. So anyhow, I ended up teaching there. I kept working on my master's degree at Bowling Green State University. And when Jan and I got married, I still didn't have my degree, although I had taken on a job in Hagerstown, Maryland, with the expectation that I was going to finish the master's within the semester. So they hired me anyhow. And poor Jan, she had to type that master's thesis over and over and over again until we got it right. Not that she didn't type well, it's just that I kept changing my game plan. But bless her heart, she hung in there with me. And when Jan was there, she'd gotten her degree from Catholic University in church music. Oh no, in what was it, Jan? Parish work. And so she got a job there at the church, Lutheran church in Hagerstown, Maryland, and we stayed there for a year. And her father had just bought 92 national homes, which were a disaster. It's called Splinter Village in Findlay, Ohio. And he flew out with my parents and his wife, Nellie. And I should have known something was up. He had his own private plane. He flew out and said, "Denny, help. I'm losing $6,000 to $8,000 a month." Back then, 1968, that was a lot of money. He didn't realize that there were 20 to 30 empty properties when he bought them, and they were literally a total wreck. So he coached Jan and I in coming back, and he says, "You're a farm boy, you can handle it." And I tell you, Jan and I really worked hard. We worked for 3 years straight without one day off, except when Christmas was during the week. We never worked Sunday except for emergencies, and we had quite a few emergencies those first 3 years to turn that project around. And Jan really worked hard. I felt sorry for her, but I kept pushing her anyhow. She ran the office. She was giving harp lessons. She was raising kids. They were real young then. We would get up at 6 o'clock every morning, go to work at 6:30, work till 11 o'clock every night, and at 11:30 we went to bed. And we did that for 3 years straight without one day off. And I kept saying to Jan, I said, "It's worth it. We keep working like this, we're going to make it. That's how you get ahead. And every dollar we make, we'll save." I was so tight about money that I had a budget plan made out that Jan had to stick to right down to the penny. And she kept a budget going. Every dollar we made, every dollar we spent. She learned how to do bookkeeping, and she worked really hard. I don't know how she did it, like a trooper. But we got through it. One day I came home, I remember at lunch, and the light came on. I said, "Jan, we can work hard like this the rest of our life. We'll have a decent living, but we'll never get ahead." I said, "The people who have gained wealth are the people who have invested." It's just like a light bulb came on. And I said, "We need to start investing." So I talked to Jan's dad. There were another 20 national homes still available that were in equally bad shape. We expected the worst, and we got the worst. I mean, there was probably the first year I probably replaced 20 furnaces that had carbon monoxide poisoning in it, and tenants were living in some of those houses. I mean, it was well, the weeds were as high as my waist. And I remember one house we went to where the people had shut the inside of the bedroom door, and they were walking around the outside. There was a trail walking, and they'd broken out a window in a glass pane and threw the trash back into the house in a bedroom. And I remember finally getting that wedged open the door so I could scoop it out. And at the end of the mess, when we got to the end, it was rumbling with mice and rats. It was literally that bad. Cockroaches all over the place. I'm telling you, it was a war. But we got on top of it. The way we got on top of it was we started advertising this New Look neighborhood, because I'd go to a neighbor and say, "Hey, we got 90-some houses that are bad. If you paint yours and the people on the other side paint theirs and fix it up," I said, "we'll fix the one up in between you. And if they didn't want it, fine, I just move on down the street." Well, pretty soon, what made that whole project go was the people, there were like 400 houses there, and we had about 1/4 of them. They got involved fixing theirs up, and we were able to turn that whole splinter village around, and it became New Look neighborhood. So then I got the wise idea that Jan's dad helped us. He co-signed with us for $75,000 to assume those mortgages on those 20 houses. And we made monthly payments on those. We didn't know where the money was coming from. We made it work. And the countdown, when those mortgages got paid off, that was kind of a celebration for each one of those individual properties. But I decided, well, you know, I'm gonna get my sales license in real estate. So I did. And then Jan's dad had just sold a Pruden. He was with Pruden, had the Pruden Steel Company. They just sold that, I think, in 68, 69, something like that, maybe a little later. But anyhow, I said, well, why don't you get your real estate license? And so he did get his real estate license. I think he thought he was going to retire, but his son-in-law wasn't going to let him do that. And so we started a Bishop Kendall real estate office, and it grew really fast. I know within 3 years we were #1 sales office in Findlay, and Jan's dad had the foresight of developing an office that was an old service station at the corner of 224 and 12, and we were ahead of the game as far as our competition goes. We remodeled that and made it a really nice office. We joined a franchise, and in a few years we were doing 1/4 to 1/3 of all the business in Findlay as far as real estate goes. We had a great team. Having been a school teacher, I did a lot of training. We required the students to take brass tacks of real estate, and they all had to take Dale Carnegie sales course. And we were really strict about that, but it grew. And we had a lot of sales concerts that had spheres of influence. We'd pick somebody from Marathon, somebody from Cooper, somebody from different businesses, and so they would compete against each other and help. So it grew. There were 18 offices when we were doing almost 1/3 of all the business in Findlay. We were doing both commercial and residential. So that proved out well. And that was going fine. I was working 16 hours a day. We had remodeled a house on the corner of Crystal and Folk Avenue. We had 5 hard lines coming into the house. And I remember on average, I would take 2 phone calls at supper time. And we had little kids running around and in high chairs, and they had to keep quiet. Jen had a real responsibility to keep them quieted down. But we were just going. I couldn't keep up with it. I was going literally 16 hours a day. Jan was running the rental office, and I was doing the real estate, and I just couldn't run fast enough. Finally, my oldest son, Kurt, who was in junior high, came to me one day and said, "Dad, can I have a rabbit?" Well, I'm a farm boy. Of course you can have a rabbit. A couple of days later, he came to me and said, "Dad, would you help me build a rabbit cage?" And I opened up my book of appointments, and I said, "Kurt, I don't have 1 hour open in the next 2 weeks." And what I also knew that the 2 weeks after that was going to be filled up by the time those 2 weeks were over. And you know, I couldn't sleep that night. My conscience really bothered me. And I'm the type of guy that I list things down on priorities for the next day. I learned that through Dale Carnegie, but I listed down a couple pages on 3x5 cards. And my father-in-law was down in Florida. They were living in the wintertime in Florida. And I called him. I says, "Gene Candle," that was the father-in-law. I said, "We need to sell one of the business." He says, "What? Why would you sell any of your businesses? They're both going fantastic." I said, "Well, I made a list here. I want to go over it with you. #1, I want to spend more time with my family." And he said, "Stop." He said, "Sell one of the businesses." It almost brings tears to my eyes, even to this day, that he had enough wisdom to know that we were overworked and that I was letting the family slide by. And he said, "Stop, sell. I don't care which one it is, sell one of them." So we ended up selling the brokerage business. And after that, Jan and I bought a motorhome, and we took off out west. I always liked the West. And Jan and I enjoyed traveling too. And so for 6 weeks, we traveled out west with the junior high kids. It took me a long time to relax, but I just thank the good Lord that He caught me, as far as my conscience goes, of getting rid of one of the businesses and spending more time with family, because had we not have done that, I would have lost the family for sure. So that was a real, and I enjoyed working. I really enjoyed it, but you know, I got my priorities wrong. I always said God first, family second, and work third. And we worked the work at least 80 hours a week. So that proved how much more important the other two were. But I was letting the family go. And so that was a big change in my life. I was involved with community. I always felt giving back to community. I'll just run through a quick list. I was real estate board president. I was on the hospital board and the foundation board. I was chairman of the hospital board for a couple of years. I was on the board for Youth for Christ for quite a few years. Rotary, 30 plus years, still on that. Was board president 1 year. Also involved with global leadership on that board. We did mission trips to Russia and Ukraine, and the deal there was to teach Judeo-Christian principles of the free enterprise system. I was on the University of Findlay board. So I believe in paying back to community and giving of my time there. And of late, in giving back to community, Jen and I developed a recreational center on our farm. It's a basketball court / tennis court, a volleyball court. It's paid back to community. We're kind of midpoint between Macomb, Van Buren, and Liberty Benton. And all three schools use that facility. I'm guessing it's used 5 days out of the week. We built that for anybody to enjoy. We've had weddings there. We've had reunions. A lot of kids use it for recreation. We also have a meeting there for Youth for Christ or other church organizations who want to have that facility available, and then for youth, they can use the recreation area and come back and do Bible studies. So that has worked out really well. And then on top of that, I had bought the old YMCA campground. I bought it out of defense because I heard that 2 fellows from Canada were interested in it, and I didn't know who they might have as a ghost bidder. So I went over there to buy it because I didn't want it to be stripped down and they would leave and leave us with nothing there. And I'm a strong believer in maintaining the woods as much as we can. And so I ended up buying it. Our older son Kurt used that as a facility to teach young kids in wilderness studies and practices, and a new organization called On Target came along and wanted to rent it, of which we rented it to them. They were out of Canton, Ohio, and they work with youth. And so we rented it to them for a couple of years, and they wanted to build a new building there, of which they are in the process of building right now. And Jan and I have dedicated $500,000 towards the development of that building, so it can be used. Basically, it's a faith-based organization that they study the wilderness and they get involved with Bible studies, and you know, it's kind of payback to community. And to me, that has an extra emphasis on it's about God's kingdom, of reinvesting into God's kingdom and helping the youth, getting them away from doing all the stuff that they do with computers, and getting them outside and enjoying nature. Well, anyhow, of the 3 kids, I can't be more proud as a father than I could be of our 3 kids. Kurt is the oldest one, and he has a real gift, very, very bright. He didn't get that from me, he got that from his mother. He has a law degree, but he dedicated his life to God's service, about his kingdom. He's extremely well organized. He manages our rental office. Rental office now has almost 400 rental units. And he kind of oversees that whole project. We did get other people involved, partners. We brought on partners. My feeling there was to get them involved and get them into the game, being financially responsible as well. And so we developed partnerships where at the end of the day they will have a pretty good income, and it becomes a part of their retirement. So we got two programs going there. One with Dave Garmotter under Bishop Candle Rentals, and another one with Dave Todd, who used to work for Youth for Christ, and we're developing a project there, and both of them are involved, and it'll make a good retirement system when they're done. But Kurt oversees that whole thing. What I really like about Kurt is his philosophy of life, giving back to God's work. A very, very capable individual. He has some organizational skills that are above average for sure. He's also a great father and a great husband. Got a great wife. All three children, two of them are married now, and they're all doing well. Bruce always wanted to go into farming. I said, Bruce, you can't go into farming. You don't have any farms to farm. You don't have any machinery. I said, I'll tell you what, you go to ag school and I'll start buying farms and equipment, of which he did. And Bruce, our second son, very, very gifted in mechanics. He actually is a genius in developing new equipment. You should see his barn. It's full of all the equipment he has designed himself. He has the great ability to take something that is complicated and make it really simple and very functional. I just learned a couple of days ago that he's going to build a pickup truck for this summer, or I mean for this winter. But he has a great shop. He had the unfortunate experience of losing his wife about 7 years ago to cancer. So he had to raise two boys, and he had to be a mother and a father. And he took those boys out into the shop, and both of those boys are really good young Christian people who love the Lord, and they know the mechanics. I mean, it's astonishing what they can do work-wise as far as mechanics go. He was a really good teacher in that regard. And the other thing I like about both of those boys is that they're willing to help other people. They go out of the way to help people. I mean, in Bruce's case, they'll come into the shop. Hey, how would you fix this? Oh, pretty soon, Bruce has got his nose in the machine and is getting it all fixed up. And then we have our daughter, Dawn, who's a great harpist. She learned that from her mother. Three lovely girls, a gifted husband. God gave her the talent of being able to play the harp, and she has used it well. She has a strong work ethic, and is trying to instill that on her young three girls. They live in Chicago. I couldn't be more blessed. And then on top of all those three kids, my wife, I don't know how she put up with me as long as she did, because you know, we work together as a husband-wife team in a business, and I'm not so certain that's a good thing for a lot of couples, particularly us, because I dominated her and pushed her really hard to do work that her first love was harp, and she always wanted to be a harpist. Well, she sacrificed all those years of raising the kids and doing the business, and now she has a chance to do her harp thing. for that reason, she spends a lot of time down in Panama, where we have a condo, and starting a harp emphasis down there. It's got a couple of harps down there, working real close to the with the music groups down there, and I'm thankful for her that she has a chance to do what she's always wanted to do her whole life. She's got a gift with music, and her first love is harp, and she's been the mother of many harp students here in Findlay, and is trying to develop that in Panama, and more power to her. One of the things that we have a little problem with is in the religious department that she's a diehard Lutheran. She went through catechism, and that meant a lot to her, and the liturgy. She studied parish work. That was her major in college. So her relationship to God is very important, and her worshiping the Lutheran style is very important. But I felt I grew up in a more fundamental church, and the liturgy didn't mean that much to me, and catechism was very important in the Lutheran church, and I could see that the kids who were graduating from catechism seemed to be dropping out of church as soon as catechism was over, and I just didn't think that was right for our kids. And so I broke them away, and we walked to a church nearby, the Nazarene church where we lived, and I went that way. And I know that was a disappointment to Jan, but I just felt like they needed a strong foundation in religion. And I'm not taking anything against the Lutheran system, because it's a worshipful experience for Jan. It means a lot to her, but I just didn't feel like our kids were connecting in that way. And then we got involved with the Mennonite church over St. John's, because there was a biblical teacher there, a minister, and he really tied the Old Testament to the New Testament, and I think that was good for our kids. But I just wanted to share the fact that I feel like I've taken advantage of Jan in the work process of a husband and wife team, because I was very dominant in that regard, and that was quite unfair to Jan over all those years. Well, we've covered a lot of different things. In addition to the real estate, the farm, something about farming. We've acquired quite a few farms. I just noticed that on our insurance policy now, as a family unit, all three kids being involved, that we have ownership of over 5,000 acres, and that was accumulated over the years. Just keep buying farms, and the Lord has blessed us in that regard. We've been very, very fortunate. Of course, we lived through good times. We lived through the zenith of the United States economically, and we obviously took advantage of that. Our philosophy, Bruce's and my philosophy of farming, is that we take good care of the land. We try to be good stewards. We do no-till conservation practices. I have a real passion for taking a farm that is really worn down and buying it and doing the whole gamut to make it a productive farm. One of the things we have to do is tile it, which is relatively expensive. It costs about $1,000 an acre to do that. Then we fertilize it, bring the fertility up. We get the weeds under control. We do tram lines in our where we use the same path every year. We're very sophisticated as far as GPS goes, and running our equipment, etc. We try not to even drive over the ground where the tram lines are not, the paths whereby we plant and do our fertilizer and our spraying and all that stuff. So we try to be really good stewards. With my background in biology and the emphasis we have with treating God's planet, we try to improve it wherever we go. And fortunately, Bruce feels the same way, and so it's made a good team in that regard. One of the things we do not do, as many farmers do in the area, is we do not work on Sunday. And I think that stems all the way back when I was a kid growing up. We were on our way to church one Sunday, all 5 of us packed in the back seat of that Chevy car. I think it was a Chevy, yeah. And Dad never worked on Sunday except doing chores, of course. And he looked off the side, and there we had a tomato field, and one of the workers was out there picking tomatoes. And he stopped the car, backed up, and went out in the field and said, "You know, we don't work on Sunday." And the worker said, "But we got a really hard frost coming tonight. You're going to lose your biggest picking of the year." The tomatoes were just red all over there. They were ripe. And my dad said, "Well, that may be true, but God has always provided. We're not going to pick tomatoes today." Of course, the worker wanted to work because he could make a lot of money that day, but Dad stood by his firm convictions there, and so the guy had to walk off the field. But that stuck in my mind, and I said to Bruce when we went in farming, I said, "One thing we're not going to do is work on Sunday," and he is obliged by that, and the Lord has blessed us. If you work hard 6 days, who are we to argue with God that when He commanded us to take the 7th day off? I don't want to try to force His hand in that regard. I guess a driving force to me is that God put us on earth for a reason. That God has given each of us different talents. We are to use those talents in regard to developing His kingdom to be bettered. I feel like our children are doing that. Jan, my wife, has been in with that idea as well as I have tried to do that. The concept of not continuing to work at my age, retirement, I don't think Jan feels that way, neither do I. As long as God gives us the physical and the mental abilities, I think we should continue doing His thing. Retirement is not something that's talked about in the Bible, except when the priests at age 55 back then, they could retire. But as long as God gives you the ability to keep working, why not? It's all about His kingdom, and that happens to be my particular philosophy. So, I wake up in the morning ready to go to do another project. I got more projects to do than I will live long enough to get them done. So unless I live to be 140 years old, I know by age 130 I will have invented more projects to get done. So, okay. What do I like to do? I enjoy the outdoors. I love adventure. Jan and I belong to an international living, or did belong to that. We spent a lot of time going to different islands and different countries, including Europe. We've been to a lot of countries, Australia, New Zealand, Central America, South America. We've been into a lot of countries. I just enjoy being around other cultures and other people. I think what made the United States great is our Judeo-Christian principles was a foundation by which this country was predicated on, and a good work ethic. I'm not so certain that we are continuing that work ethic today as we once knew it. And I think the country is failing a lot in that regard. We've become a soft culture. One thing, I don't really trust Washington and all the politics that are going on. And Jan and I decided we were going to go to Nicaragua, and after going through international living and going to all these different places, And because it was cheaper along the shorelines of the Pacific, relative to Panama and to Costa Rica, it was about a third the cost. So we started investing there, bought some lots. We have a condo down there, even to this day. And the politics changed. Daniel Ortega came into power, and upon his coming to power, he became much more of a socialist. And I knew the monies were going to dry up from Canada, Europe, and the United States. So we bailed out of there. We've been to Panama a couple of different times, so we ended up with International Living. So we ended up making that a place to go in the winter months. And that's worked out very well. We're not invested there so heavily, but I do have some monies taken out of the United States while I have a chance to get it out of the United States into a bank down there. We have a nice condo there. I've always enjoyed a good sense of humor. I enjoy play on words and puns, and much to the unliking of some of my family members. I have enjoyed life. As I said before, we've been through the zenith of the United States as far as I'm concerned. In summary, I think, if I'm looking back, I think the most important thing that I want to pass on to, as far as our legacy is concerned, is a rich value on Christian living. That's what I'd like to pass on. I know that's Jan's philosophy as well. The good Lord has blessed us in so many different ways, and I'd like to pass on those blessings on to others. I guess the biggest disappointment is that I haven't accomplished as much as I think I should have by the time I'm 80 years old. If I had to do over, I would have gotten into the investment world at a quicker age than waiting when the light came on that Jan and I started investing. I had the privilege of having a wife who did not curtail my vision of investments. She always said, Denny, you don't think anything about going out here and investing $1 million on a piece of property, but you have a hard time buying a jacket for yourself. And that's probably true, but the nice thing is that Jan never kept me from making the investments that I felt that would be advantageous to own. So not many husbands can feel that good about their wives in the decision-making process.